with the NCAA losing more of its legal power, how long do you think its current system will last? And who do you think will step in to enforce the rules in college football sports for the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think the NCAA is going anywhere. The NCAA, for all of its for all the criticism it receives, it does a really good job with that basketball tournament, and it generates a ton of revenue from it. And I also don't know there's no sort of substitute for it. I think what we could see is conferences, especially power conferences, continue to operate almost autonomously without the NCAA. I think we're seeing that with TV deals. It wouldn't surprise me if we see the Southeastern Conference really spin off more and more away from the NCAA into something that's almost like a pro league, which is really what it already is at this point, if we're being honest about it. It's developing football players for the NFL and making a lot of money. It's a really popular product that obviously college football in the South is super popular. So I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see conferences, especially at that level, kind of continue to break free of the NCAA. But I think for a lot of schools, that's just not the model. The model is not really quasi-pro sports. At a lot of schools, the players are not the players are not, if we're being honest, NFL prospects. And they're really college students who are playing football as part of their kind of college life. And they're using hopefully they're using football as a means of getting a good education and doing something else. I still think that dynamic is true at most schools, but the power conferences have really evolved into something a lot more similar to pro sports.
How would you feel on a federal standard being set, like versus the NCAA rules?
Yeah, it depends on what, right? So for example, there are some bills in Congress that would try to create national, like you just said, federal rules on different aspects of college life. One is called the SCORE Act. The SCORE Act has gotten some media attention. The SCORE Act, if it became law, would state that college athletes are not employees. I think the problem with a law like that is that it's likely to face its own set of legal challenges. So take the SCORE Act and the stipulation that college athletes cannot be employees. The problem with that is that it arguably undermines states' rights. And I say that because whether somebody's an employee and whether they can join a union if they work at a public university has traditionally been a question of state law, not federal law. And obviously that's really relevant in college sports, right? Because a lot of major programs are at public universities. So whether an Alabama football player can be an employee is really a question of Alabama law, not federal law. So I think that's one concern I have with federal standards is that they'll likely attract legal challenges that make things more chaotic. And then there's also equal protection arguments. I've talked to lawyers that will very likely bring equal protection challenges. But when I say equal protection, the Constitution generally requires that we treat people equally. So if we treat college athletes worse than their classmates, including employment, that presents a potential equal protection challenge. And, a lot of people say, how could college athletes be employees? Well, colleges employ all sorts of students, right? I mean, some of you may be employees of your college. It's not unusual at all. Work study is a means of employment. And this has come up where we have seen college athletes at Dartmouth College, right in our region, argue that they're employees. And it's interesting at Dartmouth, part of it is because the students who work in the cafeteria are employees of Dartmouth and they unionized. And that led the basketball players to think, and there's one player who worked in the cafeteria and he thought if I twist my ankle moving a food cart, I get workers' comp. If I twist my ankle going for a rebound, I don't get anything. I get whatever benefits are provided as an athlete. So it leads some people to think, well, it's kind of odd that we allow student workers in some capacities and not others. Or, work study, you could have a work study student have a roommate who's a football player, and the roommate whose work study could be literally working at that football game, taking tickets, providing sodas and things like that. that student gets paid what the football player doesn't. It's really interesting.
What antitrust or labor challenges await the NCAA, and should athletes prepare for unionization?
That's a great question. So I don't think we're going to see unionization in the immediate future, but what I do think we're going to see a continuation of a current case I'll talk about in a minute, and then I think we'll see unionization efforts at the state level. So the current case is called Johnson versus NCAA. Johnson versus NCAA is out of Pennsylvania, and it's brought by a group of college athletes, men and women, who argue that they should be considered employees under what's called the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA. The FLSA is the law that if your work study ensures that you make minimum wage, that's what the FLSA does, minimum wage and overtime pay. And the argument that the players have brought is that they're at least employees under the FLSA and they should be given minimum wage and, if applicable, overtime pay. And that case is actually doing well so far. So that's one case to watch for. That wouldn't make them union, it wouldn't give them unionization rights, but presumably some will try to unionize once if this case is successful. The other way that I think we'll see college athletes as employees would be a public university in a state that's labor friendly. So the Dartmouth scenario is interesting because it's a private school, right? Dartmouth is a private college. And under federal law, the National Labor Relations Act governs private employers. So those players argued they were employees under a federal law, the NLRA, and they were winning. The regional director in Boston found that they were employees. But as you know, there was an election last fall, and that changed the composition of the National Labor Relations Board. The players decided with their union that they didn't think it looked favorable because of some political changes, so they withdrew. But it can still happen at the state level. So there could be a public university where the athletes argue that they're employees under state law. That is where I think it will happen. And I think it's just a matter of time. It wouldn't surprise me if we see it in a state like California or Minnesota, maybe Michigan. There are some states that are relatively labor friendly that have a history of unions. Probably not in New England, for being honest. It's probably not the greatest test play. I mean, Massachusetts actually maybe, but my guess is that we see it in a state that's very labor friendly. So if you're a college athlete, I don't think anything changes this school year, but in a school year or two, it might. And you'll hear is here's the thing, you're going to hear the other side. You're going to hear schools say, well, if they're employees, we have to cut our sports program because we can't pay, even minimum wage, we can't pay, they're going to say. And they're going to point out all sorts of things. I don't know if you've studied this, if you heard about it in other classes, but these are tough times for colleges because of something called the enrollment cliff. So starting in 2008, there were fewer babies born. And that means there are fewer American children that are of college age that will be going to school over the next 10 to 15 years. So enrollments at colleges are expected to drop. It's good if you're a student because that means you can negotiate more aid from your college because there's fewer people trying to get slots. Good for students, not good for colleges. And then of course there's, obviously the federal government's cutting grants, making it harder for international students to study here. So in other words, colleges are going to say we can't pay. This is the worst time possible for us. They said this with revenue sharing, and they're going to say it with employment as well. And it will mean, I think, some programs get cut, but it's going to be an interesting test of leadership at a lot of schools. What do they prioritize? Are they willing to cut sports? Are they willing to deal with the repercussions of that? Are there other things they could cut instead? Really an interesting period we're in.
Our question is, other than within the legal system, what's the main reason the NCAA lacks power, and what can the organization do to regain power?
Thank you. So I think one main reason, other than that, it's just a private association, right? It's not the government. It's literally just it's a membership association. It's like a country club, except the members, instead of being country club members, are schools. That's really what the NCAA is. I think they lack power in part because they are often the target of criticism and that they don't have a natural constituency. There are conservatives who don't like the NCAA. There are liberals who don't like the NCAA. They're often sort of they're often kind of the recipient of criticism, whatever the topic may be. I mean, it could be college athletes' rights. I think the debate over trans athletes is one that the NCAA has received criticism for, whether somebody supports trans athletes or opposes them. The NCAA's position didn't seem to generate approval from any constituency, and I think that led to more criticism of them. And I think the NCAA, at least not maybe recently, but historically, has been seen as favoring certain schools over others. And that's important because politicians notice that, right? If you're a politician from a school that believes it's being mistreated by the NCAA, you're going to be inclined to support that school. So I think part of it is that the NCAA is often seen as kind of slow moving, that it's sort of trying to make compromises in ways that don't lend itself to a constituency. Again, I think whether somebody's conservative or liberal, they're going to have criticisms for the NCAA. So they haven't really found their voice. They haven't found an audience. And I think that limits its power too.
And the second part was, what is something the organization can do to regain power?
So I think the NCAA has a relatively new president in Charlie Baker, the former governor of Massachusetts. I think he has tried to be sort of more reasonable, for lack of a better word, in his leadership. He supported paying athletes. I mean, that's a profound change. The fact that the House settlement, and maybe they should make more, that could be argued, but his predecessors never would have agreed to this. The idea that colleges can directly share revenue with athletes. That is a profound change that he had to sign off on. So I think that helps in the sense that he's trying to be pragmatic. He's trying to not forget that there are other schools that maybe don't have the capacity of paying athletes. So his leadership, I think, helps because he is going into it, I think, with a more realistic approach than some of his predecessors. But it's still the NCAA, and conferences move way faster. And conferences operate really like businesses. Conferences are less likely, especially power conferences. The NCAA has to think about its membership as 1,200 schools, right? So you have small schools, you have big schools. These power conferences, their members are huge universities that make a ton of money. So they operate more like businesses. They move faster. Their priorities are much more business oriented. So I think the NCAA can seem slow moving and maybe even inept because they don't really treat the issues the same way as power conferences do.
So the NCAA is the one who says they can't be paid at used to, but also seems to be the one helping create most of the revenue. When you exclude the NCAA media contracts and the video games, what would be left for the athletes to be making money?
Thanks. The ticket sales are still there, right? So there's still gate receipts that lead to money, and that is one source of revenue. Obviously, video games, as you mentioned, is a growing source of revenue that now college athletes can get a share of. But at the end of the day, media rights, just like in the NFL, just like in the other major pro leagues, that's the differentiator for college sports. If your sport doesn't get on TV, it will never really get attention. And this is a major hurdle for sports that certainly that are not football or basketball. There are other sports in college that, periodically get on TV, but it's not the same sort of sustained way that college football in particular, but also college basketball, men's and women's do. So I think, if the NCAA would, and I know they know this, they really have to prioritize media rights. That is where the money is, just like in the NFL. That's where most of that money is for the NFL. It's not gate receipts, it's TV money. And the same is true in college sports. And that is, I think, a source of frustration for kind of sports that are not generating as much revenue. Tennis, college tennis, right? Like that's not a sport that gets a lot of attention. Maybe it's on ESPN periodically, but it's not really in sort of mainstream media discussion. track and field. I mean, it's a great sport. If any of you do track, incredible sport, but it doesn't translate to TV. And I don't know, the NCAA sort of, it's not their fault in a way. That's just kind of the nature of what viewers like to watch. I do think it's interesting to think about whether there can be a shift in talent for college sports. So the NCAA recently allowed a former G League player to join Santa Clara, their men's basketball team. And what's interesting about that is that if in fact former pros who didn't go to college can now go to college, that could, I think, would help soccer a lot because there are a bunch of pro soccer players, not like Premier League, but maybe kind of a couple notches down, that would probably be interested in going to college to play sports. That could potentially boost those other sports.
Do you think there would be money to share with the ticket sales and school store merch?
There's less, right? There's way less. I mean, there's something there. There's something there, and the tricky part there is how do you divide it? So, as you all know, I was a lawyer for Maurice Claret, who played at Ohio State, and he had the number one selling jersey at Ohio State, like in history. And if we're only sharing the campus store and online sales for merch, I mean, shouldn't he get more than his teammates? I mean, one could make that argument. This is the tricky part of this new college sports world where, they're, in the NFL, when your professor played, I mean, Tom Brady, I think everyone would agree should get paid the most, right? I mean, that would make sense. Similarly, shouldn't that be true in college sports? Shouldn't the stars, particularly, a star quarterback, wouldn't it make sense that he gets paid more than others? I mean, this is why the NCAA will say this conversation is why they should remain amateurs, because this gets people uncomfortable, right? It's like, well, they're students, but one is going to make more than others. I mean, there's no easy answer there.
How much influence do networks like ESPN, Fox, CBS wield in shaping NCAA policies, scheduling, and even rules, given their massive media deals?
That's a great question. I mean, tremendous influence, particularly, I mean, it's all about TV, if we're being honest about it. It's all about media rights in particular in TV. And, when I say TV, I would include streaming in that definition. I think it's evolved into something different than, what it was 10, 15 years ago. The, in terms of scheduling of games, a lot of the scheduling is geared towards maximizing revenue, right? Maximizing TV ratings. Now we're seeing conferences think about arrangements where revenue isn't shared equally by colleges for media rights, but instead based on different metrics. So, yeah, I mean, ESPN, all of these no, they'll say they don't decide what a school schedule is, but they can certainly have an influence over what a school does because the school wants to maximize TV. And yeah, like you can't blame the school. They want to make as much money as they can. They're going to argue that that's healthy for the program. There's nothing wrong with it. But I mean, I don't think that conversation, I mean, what about impact of the studies of the football players, right? Like if you're traveling California to Florida, then to Nebraska, I mean, that's a ton of travel in the middle of the semester. I'm guessing some of you play for a team in college. It's hard, right? It's hard. You're traveling, you're missing class, you're tired, right? And you're expected to be full-time students. I worry that that part of the conversation gets left out when schools are so focused on maximizing media rights because they're not thinking about impact on the students. And the reality is most of them are not going to go to the NFL, and they're better off doing well and getting a meaningful degree.
Do you see in the near future if it's possible for the NCAA to implement a salary cap, whether it's roster salary cap or conference salary cap?
So, I mean, the short answer is not in the immediate future because it would be illegal. A salary cap that isn't born through collective bargaining would face an antitrust lawsuit. And there have been, over the years, when pro leagues try to impose salary restraints when it's not bargained with the union, it's considered a violation of antitrust law. And this, I think the same would be true here. If there's a salary cap that isn't negotiated with the union, it would be fair game for an antitrust lawsuit. And this is one of the hurdles. You know, the NCAA kind of wants it both ways. They don't want the players to be employees, but that also means, you know, they can't collectively bargain with the players. If there was a let's say there's a union for football players in power conferences. I mean, that union could negotiate a CBA with those conferences and the NCAA that has a salary cap, that has other salary, maybe that has a minimum salary or maximum salary, could have all sorts of rules. And it wouldn't be challengeable under antitrust law because it would be collectively bargained. But that's not the world we're in, and colleges don't want that world. But I think eventually they will, to be honest with you, because that world avoids antitrust litigation. And I think there's a pretty compelling argument that certainly football players at power conferences are really functioning as employees. That doesn't mean they aren't students as well, but they could be both.
If they did do something like that, you're adding in, workers' comp, you're adding in retirement plans, and then you're adding in everything that the NFL sees or the NBA sees with their post-retirement health reimbursement accounts. Then you get into neurocog issues,
Right.
health issues that you would also have to address. Is that something that you would see? Because you mentioned the Power Four conferences, and especially the SEC. That seems like our conference that could actually pull that off.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, and they have the sophistication to deal with those issues, right? I mean, you mentioned obviously collective bargaining has all sorts of pieces to it, including workers' comp, including disability payment. I mean, but those schools, they have the capacity of doing it. They have the financial wherewithal. They could get advice from an existing union to provide expertise on how to negotiate those things. I do think it makes sense at that level, at least. I mean, I get there are concerns about, well, does that mean, the volleyball player at a Division II school is also an employee? I understand that there need to be some sort of potential limits to what is employment in this context. But I think there's a pretty strong argument that football players at power conferences, if you look at not only, even if you exclude the revenue they're generating, the amount of control over their time that schools have, right? In terms of travel, in terms of what classes they can take, in terms of the fact that they're recruited to play football. I mean, that's really the primary form of recruitment. It isn't to be a student. I mean, that's part of it as well, but it's admissions decisions are made for purposes of football. They certainly seem to check a lot of boxes that they're functioning as employees. And you're right to point out that it gets complicated. There are a lot of terms in a CBA. You know, the NFL CBA, it's hundreds of pages, right? I mean, it's a long, complicated document, but they could do it. It's obtainable. It takes some negotiation, but I think it is doable.
Yeah, I would assume any conference that has that built in would automatically have an advantage recruiting players, because not only would they pay you medical issues, retirement, post playing career, you'd be dealing from the bottom of the deck, I would assume, based on what you can offer as opposed to what the Big 12 could offer.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, certainly those schools that would offer collective bargaining protections would have a huge recruiting advantage over other schools. Now, I think they already do, right? I mean, it's sort of, if you're a top recruit, you want to go to one of these schools, right? Especially if you're a real NFL prospect, I think they already have the built-in advantage, but it would amplify that.
What are your opinions on the current state of the transfer portal, and how do you think it'll change the competitive nature of the NCAA moving forward?
So I think we're going to gradually see, the NCAA, I think, is now this week thinking about making changes to it. It's hard for the NCAA to restrict transfers because these are students, and as a student, you can transfer to college. It's really up to you and the school you want to transfer to. There's no restraint on that. And we saw a federal judge in a case called Ohio versus NCAA reject a restriction on transfers. The NCAA had a transfer rule restricting if you wanted to transfer a second time, you had to get their permission. And the judge said that that's an antitrust violation because the schools have gotten together to limit how players can transfer. So the transfer portal is certainly vulnerable to antitrust challenge. Now, I mean, I understand the school's position that they want to have some sort of stability with this, that you don't want people just jumping around schools. I get that. It's probably not good for their education either, but it's a difficult area to restrict. My guess is the NCAA will if the transfer portal is challenged in court, they're going to argue that it's not a perfect system, but it's reasonable. And that's really the key test under antitrust law. I mean, can I jump in for a second? I mean, this goes back to collective bargaining. If there's a CBA, there can be all sorts of restrictions on transferring. It's the fact that they're not employees, that they're students, that actually undermines the NCAA's position. Because we don't restrict students, just students, not forget whether they play a sport, from transferring. Schools can't get together to restrain how students transfer. So the same logic applies for athletes. But if the athletes were employees of their schools, then they could sign employment contracts. Then you can't leave. I mean, so some of these are kind of like unforced errors. They're errors because the NCAA doesn't want them to be employees. Well, there are consequences to that.
Couple more. You mentioned some media rights and TV deals. Do medias, the ABCs, the CBS, do they have too much influence and power on how things work?
I think in an ideal world, they wouldn't have as much influence, but I also think in the worlds we're in, it's undeniable that they really dictate decisions because so much revenue is made from, and so schools are so reliant on media rights to make the bottom line that I don't think there's a way around that. I honestly don't. Maybe if power conferences were their own like super league, they could have more bargaining power together with media companies, but we're not in that world.
So Michael, if you were to fix the system in an ideal world, if you had complete power to fix it to the way you think it would work the best and take fair out of it, because what would you do?
I would separate power conference football from everything else, number one. I would have it, I would have the players be employees, and I would urge them, I mean, whether they unionize is up to the schools, to the players, but it would make a lot more sense to have that system operate more like a pro league. That doesn't mean they're not students. They can, they're still full-time students. They still go to class. They still get a college degree, but we're going to see nonstop antitrust litigation until that is in place. So unless these schools and the NCAA like litigating antitrust cases, and soon I imagine employment disputes, they're sort of just they're just punting until we get to that world. And it's really how much pain they want to take until we get there. So that is one system. And I think conversely, making sure that college sports, more traditional notions of college sports are preserved so that there are opportunities for other men who play sports and women to ensure that they have opportunities to continue to play college sports, that all the money doesn't gravitate towards football, that there are opportunities for media rights deals to include non-football sports, because we don't want a world where high school students who have played a sport their whole life, who care about it, maybe they'll never make money playing it, but who cares? It's a big part of who they are. It makes them better students. I mean, many athletes and would say that being an athlete helps their studies. I don't think we want to lose that. So in a perfect world, I would want us to make sure that that continues, that more sort of traditional college sports aren't lost in this spending frenzy. But I do think that change is needed, certainly for power conference football. And I would also think about women's basketball at the highest level, where we're seeing ratings go up for women's basketball. It's become I mean, there are players who are staying in college instead of going to WNBA because they make more money in college. I mean, think about that, right? Like in men's basketball is a little different because they go for a year and they go to the NBA. But I don't know. I mean, there's a lot there, but I guess my two goals would be let's be honest about power conference football, but let's not lose traditional college sports that provide educational opportunities for young people who have played a sport their whole lives and are really good at it. And the fact that they don't go to a pro league, that doesn't mean it's not important.
Last one, and we'll let you go. You mentioned education. Would you advocate for different rules and regulations or for an academic calendar for Power Four athletes, specifically football, where they're less burdened and tasks during the season, so their credits can maybe be pushed maybe during the summer, or maybe they need less? How would you improve that aspect of it?
Yeah, I think those are all great ideas. It's not fair, right? It's not fair if you're playing. I mean, some of you are playing a sport, right? Like it's not really fair. You have much less time to do schoolwork and you're expected to be full-time students. You have to take the same exams, same credits, same homework. It's not, it's literally like overtly unfair. And like a lot of schools limit the number of hours other students can work, but college athletes, I think especially in power conferences, are probably spending 40 hours a week on sports or more. So I think, Christian, to your point, allowing some flexibility, whether it mean, you have a longer period of time to get credit hours, summer classes, maybe instead of, maybe 10 credits is possible for a semester. I mean, this is where conferences, if they operate outside of NCAA rules, can come up with more sensible systems so that it doesn't punish athletes that, they're supposed to be students, but they also have enormous athletic obligations. I would say they're going to become better educated if there are more realistic academic expectations so that they can do well in them instead of feeling like they have no time to do anything.